Common Agronomic Crops of Alaska. Common Agronomic Crops of Alaska. This presentation was created through a collaboration between the Alaska Association of Conservation Districts and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. Please contact your local NRCS office with questions on the topic. Agricultural crops can be divided into two main categories: the agronomic crops, often called the commodity crops such as corn, wheat, and soybeans, and the horticultural crops, often called the specialty crops such as apples, tomatoes, and flowers. The agronomic crops are usually characterized by high acreage production, with the crop having a relatively low value on a per-pound basis. Once dried, they're relatively easy to store. One of the big distinctions is the agronomic production tends to be highly mechanized. For many of the agronomic crops, people don't actually touch the crop from planting to sales. People operate machines that do the actual work. Some of the agronomic crops are directly consumed, such as dry beans, rice, and various grains. Other agronomic crops are basic components of numerous food products: sugar beets for sugar, wheat for baked goods, field corn for virtually everything. Some of the agronomic crops, such as soybeans in the U.S., are primarily raised to increase the protein content in feed rations. The forages, such as alfalfa or various grasses, form the basis of livestock rations. The fiber crops, such as cotton and flax, provide our plant-based clothing. As opposed to the agronomic crops, the horticultural crops are usually intensively produced on relatively small acreages. They tend to be higher value per pound, they're usually more perishable, and their production often involves significant amounts of hand labor. The horticultural crops include the fruits, such as strawberries and apples, the vegetables, carrots, broccoli, sweet corn, and ornamentals like landscape trees and flowers. The USDA Agricultural Statistics Service recognizes the production of 6 agronomic crops in Alaska: hay and halage, barley, oats, wheat, and rye. We should probably add hemp to this list, but for now the USDA neither recognizes nor works with it. The Fairbanks-Delta Junction region is the major production area for the agronomic crops. Going south, there's production in the Glen Allen-Kenny Lake area, the Talkeetna-Trapper Creek region, and the Point McKenzie-Wasilla-Palmer corridor. The Kenai Peninsula has significant forage production, as does Kodiak Island. There's also significant forage production on the Seward Peninsula to support the reindeer industry, but this semi-managed production strategy is considered rangeland and is not included in the USDA agronomic data reporting. Hay is the most important agronomic crop in Alaska, both on an acreage and a value basis. The 2017 Census of Agriculture reported over 24,000 acres in production, with annual sales over $10 million. The major use of hay is livestock feed, with sales to the recreational horse market also being a strong component of the market. Forage that's been inspected and is certified as free of invasive weeds is also occasionally sold to the landscape and construction industries as an erosion control material, or the mushing industry as a bedding product. Although certified weed-free straw is usually requested in the specifications, for some projects weed-free hay can be substituted for weed-free straw. The Kenai Peninsula produces a little less than 2,000 acres of forage, the Mat-Su region a little more than 10,000 acres, and the Tanana region a bit more than 13,000 acres. As you can see from the chart, most of the forage is produced in the form of dried hay. A number of growers are also baling cover crops, but this acreage is recorded as cropland due to the main crop production, and consequently doesn't get tracked as a forage. But this strategy can be very effective in producing additional forage. So what's the difference between the forms of forage? If you have a field of grass and you fence it in and have livestock graze it directly, that's called pasture, and the acreage wouldn't be included in forage reporting. If you cut the forage and dried it down to less than 20% moisture and baled it, then it's considered hay. If you cut the forage and only allowed it to dry to 40 to 50% moisture to facilitate fermentation, that's considered hay silage. Silage is any crop that is harvested relatively wet and allowed to ferment. The lower pH and oxygen levels essentially pickle the forage, slowing down microbial degradation. If the harvested crop is corn, then the product is called corn silage. If the crop is clover, alfalfa, or the grasses, the product is called hay silage, which is often condensed to halage. Most livestock can thrive on any of the three forms, but the producers have to transition the animals from one form to the next to allow the gut microorganisms to adjust to the new type of feed. Hay versus halage. As mentioned previously, hay is a dried product. It doesn't have enough free moisture to support the decomposition organisms, and while it's kept dry, it'll be stable for a long time. After cutting, the forage is allowed to dry to a moisture content below 20%. If the forage is dried too much, the leaves will shatter in the raking and baling process, which in turn will lower the overall protein content. On the other hand, if the forage is baled too wet, there's more of a chance that the hay will mold in storage, decreasing quality. In extreme cases, the bales may spontaneously combust, possibly destroying the barn. In the USDA figures, the term halage combines both classic halage and baleage, also called sweet hay. Classic hay silage is harvested at a moisture content around 50%, blown into wagons, and stored in bunker silos, upright silos, or large plastic bags where it starts to ferment. The high acid, low oxygen conditions resulting from fermentation preserves the feed for future use. Baleage, or sweet hay, is the most common form of halage in Alaska. It's sort of a compromise between conventional hay and hay silage. The forage is picked up and baled with a conventional large baler. Rather than letting the forage dry to less than 20%, the crop is baled at a moisture content around 40%. These high moisture bales are wrapped immediately with several layers of plastic wrap to allow the microbes to ferment the forage within the wrapped bale. While the fermentation process is not as strong as classic hay silage, properly done, baleage stores well and is very palatable to livestock. In Alaska, grass forage is by far the most prevalent. Common species include timothy, brome, annual ryegrass, fescue, bluegrass, and blue joint. Of the legumes, clover is the most common, with some production of field peas, vetch, and alfalfa. While immature, barley, oats, and triticale can be harvested as forage. Livestock find oats the most palatable of the three. Forage barley is sometimes recommended to control problem weeds, where an effective herbicide is registered for use on barley but not for oats. While both quackgrass and reed canary grass are often considered weeds, if they're harvested at their optimal stages, they are both high-quality forages. The Alaska Forage Manual, created by the staff at the Plant Materials Center, is an excellent resource on the various forage species found in Alaska. Forage production follows a typical pattern in Alaska. Growers fertilize in the spring. There's an optimal window where the soil is thawed and dried up enough to support field traffic, but the forage crop has not yet begun significant growth. This window allows the heavy traffic of the fertilizer to not significantly damage the soil by traveling while the soil's too wet, and the plant has not yet started growing enough that the traffic damages the young growth. Spring is also the optimal time to apply herbicides to manage weeds. Growers should work with their local ag professional in choosing the appropriate herbicide, since it's important to rotate herbicides to stave off weed resistance. In summer, the hay is cut and left to dry, and then raked into windrows for harvest. Most commercial producers use a mower conditioner that cuts the forage, crushes the stems for better drying, and kicks the forage out the back into a windrow, all in the same operation. When drying conditions are not optimal, the crop may need to be tedded. Essentially, this operation fluffs up the hay and exposes new surfaces to the air for faster drying. Once the forage has reached the desired moisture content, it's baled or chopped for silage. The product is then removed from the field for storage. When driving through the forage production regions, you often see fields where the grower has chosen to skip that step and left the bales in the field. Some growers will wait for the ground to freeze before moving the bales to reduce traffic damage to the crop. While much of Alaska's forage is produced as a single cutting per season crop, natural growing conditions or irrigation can facilitate the opportunity for harvesting the regrowth. Growers planning on a second cutting will often broadcast additional nitrogen between bale removal and crop regrowth to ensure adequate soil nitrogen for the second cutting crop. If the second harvest has been done after the growth has been terminated by a killing frost, the growers call this very late harvest frost hay. Forage maintenance. Stand reestablishment is not very common in Alaska. There are many productive fields that are 20 to 50 years old. The Alaska Forage Manual and several UAF Cooperative Extension Bulletins give great information on stand establishment or renovation. Most maintenance is focused on weed control and nutrition. The major strategy in weed maintenance is through timely harvesting before the weed crop goes to seed. Unfortunately, this is often not the optimal harvest time for the forage crop, so the weed management window will be lost. Herbicides are primarily used for broadleaf weed control, while weeds that are grasses are often ignored. Most fertilizers are applied before the crop starts growing in the spring. Some growers will also take advantage of the period right after baling to apply fertilizer, since the soil is hard enough for traffic, but the crop is not yet regrown enough to be damaged. While most forage is produced without irrigation, there are a few operations that irrigate hay. They often make multiple harvests, and their hay is usually sold at a premium. The forms of forage preservation very much influence their off-farm sales. Hay is routinely sold off the farm. Small bales are in high demand with small-scale livestock operations and recreational horse owners that may not have the equipment necessary to handle the large round bales. The large bales are primarily sold to livestock operations that have the capacity to handle bales that weigh between 600 and 1,200 pounds apiece. Classic Halage is rarely sold off the farm because as a loose product it's difficult to handle and it spoils quickly once exposed to air. Balage is routinely sold off the farm because they're individually wrapped bales and can be handled similar to large bales of dried hay. A bit of extra care in handling is necessary to avoid puncturing the wrapper, since the hay will begin spoiling once exposed to oxygen. Weed-free forage certification is a program managed by the Alaska Division of Agriculture, where the field is inspected and certified not to have any weeds that are on the Alaska Invasive Weed List. Unfortunately, it doesn't mean there are no weeds, just none of the weeds on the specific invasive weed list. Certification allows the forage to be brought onto federal lands. Horse packers and dog mushers are the primary uses of weed-free forage, but there's some use in the landscaping and erosion control market. Forage harvest strategy depends primarily on weather and marketing strategy. Rainy weather at optimal harvest time often results in baling a lower quality forage than desired. Forage harvest is a trade-off between the protein content on a per-pound basis and sheer tonnage per acre. Young plants have a high digestible protein content, but older plants are larger and consequently yield more tonnage per acre. Some customers are looking for the highest feed value per pound, while others with less active animals are looking for hay that has a lower feed value per pound. Also, a number of customers want to see the seed head of the grasses in the bale to ensure they're getting a good quality species. Unfortunately, by the time the plant produces a seed head, its protein content is decreasing and it should have been harvested earlier for better quality. Regardless, that's what the customer wants and is willing to pay for. Oats and barley are Alaska's main grain crop, with the 2017 Ag Census reporting over 5,500 acres in production and annual sales in the $800,000 range. Oats and barley are primarily used as components in livestock rations. They raise the protein content. Their secondary use is for human consumption, primarily as flour. Barley is also used in the beer brewing process, and there's some direct consumption of oats and barley, such as oatmeal and barley soup. By far, the majority of small grain production is in the Tanana region, with small amounts also being produced in Matsu. Although the Kenai region has a long history of successful grain production, there's been no known commercial production on the peninsula for the last few years. We're not sure how the Ag Census missed it, but local ag professionals report several hundred acres of wheat grown in the Tanana region, and also several hundred acres of field peas grown to maturity. Since it doesn't make standard flour quality, the wheat is primarily grown for chicken feed, and the peas are also used as part of livestock rations. The typical pattern of small grain operations is to fertilize the soil and incorporate the fertilizer in the top 6 inches very soon after the ground thaws. Since most grain is planted with a conventional drill, the seedbed is prepared to a fairly fine consistency. Broadleaf weeds are primarily managed with herbicides, either pre-plant or post-emerge. Again, rotating herbicides is important in managing weed resistance. Harvest is almost exclusively done with a combine and usually takes place in late summer or early fall. For those with a market, the straw will be baled for various purposes. Weed-free straw is sold as bedding to the Iditarod mushers, horse packers guiding on federal land, and for various Department of Transportation erosion control purposes. Planting of small grain. Both oats and barley are very cool tolerant and don't do well in hot conditions. Alaska's production is almost exclusively with spring-planted grains, since there's not been much success with the fall-planted varieties. Barley will germinate when the soil temperature is as cool as 35 degrees Fahrenheit, while oats need the soil to warm up to at least 41 degrees. Unfortunately, actual planting dates are much more integrated than simple soil temperature, with soil moisture often being the limiting factor. Since most grain is planted with conventional drills, the soil has to be adequately dried for the fertilizing and tillage operations prior to planting, yet moist enough for proper seed germination. Over the years, Fairbanks and the Middle Tanana Valley plant around May 12th, Delta Junction, Salcha, and the Upper Tanana Valley around May 14th, with the Matsu and Kenai regions a few days later on around the 16th. All the larger grain operations use a grain drill for planting, with conventional drills being the most common. In addition to the seed hoppers, they have fertilizer boxes to add additional fertilizer between the seed rows at planting. These conventional drills work best on a fine seedbed. A few operations have a no-till drill. These drills are much heavier and are able to slice through standing residue and into undisturbed soil to place the seed and fertilizer at the required depth. Drop and broadcast seeders are only used in operations that don't have access to a drill, and these are almost exclusively smaller acreages. After the seed has been dropped on the surface of the soil, it's incorporated roughly to depth with a tillage implement. The inefficiencies of the broadcasting technique, even with an almost doubled seeding rate, usually results in a lower stand and often weedier conditions than planting with a drill. So broadcast seeding works, but not nearly as well as a grain drill. Crop management highlights for small grains in Alaska. On the fertility side, the small grains are great nutrient scavengers. That's why they're often used as a cover crop, since they have the ability to fix nutrients in the soil and prevent them from leaching. Nutrient recommendations derived from University Alaska Fairbanks research are given in the Alaska Tech Note 16. Most of the fertilizer is applied at planting using the drill. Oats and barley have relatively low water requirements, and they're usually grown without supplemental irrigation. Weed control is almost exclusively through the use of herbicides, since mechanical control is very difficult in drilled crops and virtually impossible in broadcast crops. There's a significant level of interest in certified weed-free straw, especially in interior Alaska. Virtually all commercial fields are harvested using combines, but a few acres are harvested with an antique binder and the grain is threshed separately. The dates of harvest are even more variable than the dates of planting. Grain in Alaska usually reaches physiological maturity, ripeness, by mid-August to early September, but it's rarely ready to harvest then. Both the grain and the straw have to be dry enough to run through the combine without clogging, and the August-September timeframe is often our rainiest time of year. Consequently, several days of dry weather is just as important as the timing of crop maturity. In a warm, dry season, combining can begin as early as August, while cool, moist days can delay harvest into September or even October. If both crops are grown under similar conditions, say on the same farm, barley is usually ready for harvest about a week or two before oats. One geographic pattern that seems to hold up many seasons is that the appropriate harvest conditions occur first in the interior and move south from there. Fairbanks is usually the first to harvest, followed by Delta Junction. Mat-Su is a bit later, and when Kenai had grain production, they were usually the last to begin harvesting. The flexibility in harvest dates is not unique to Alaska, but rather it's a worldwide condition. Basically, agriculture is dominated by the weather. In summary, barley, oats, and hay are the primary agronomic crops of Alaska, with most of the production being used for animal feed. The agronomic crops take up about 30,000 acres and have annual sales around $11 million. Historically, canola, also called rapeseed, was grown as an oil crop, but if there is still production, it's below levels that the Ag Census tracks. Recently, hemp, grown for food or fiber, is attracting interest as a potential new agronomic crop for Alaska. In general, because of the equipment commitment, the agronomic crops are primarily grown by larger-scale operations. In these settings, the cost of specialized equipment can be amortized over more acres. The cost efficiencies are usually just not there on smaller acreages. Whereas in the lower 48, where these crops are considered commodity crops and follow regional wholesale markets, in Alaska, the agronomic crops are primarily marketed by the farmer to the end user. Here's a list of further resources on Alaska's agronomic crops. Don't forget about contacting professionals at Cooperative Extension, the university's Ag Experiment Station, and the various soil and water conservation districts. These individuals can be a wealth of local knowledge. Thank you very much for your participation in this training module. The module was created in 2021 through a collaborative effort between the Alaska Association of Conservation Districts and the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service. Thank you very much.